Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Antone, and I'm the Senior Marketing and Events Coordinator at MAR, as well as the producer of our free webinar series. Our webinar today is Cybercrime Prevention. This webinar will cover how prevention is as much a factor of behavior as technology. Today, you'll learn about the misconceptions of cybercrime and how you can safeguard yourself from future attacks. After our live session, the webinar will be recorded and added to our website at marealtor.com. If you have any questions throughout the session, please type them in the chat box on your screen, and we will hold a Q&A afterward. Our presenter today is Wade Richmond. Wade is the founder and CEO of CISO ToGo, LLC, and holds over 35 years of experience in the IT field. Most recently, he has been responsible for establishing and managing the cybersecurity and technology risk programs at large enterprises like BJ's Wholesale Clubs, Citizens Financial Group, CVS Pharmacies, and much more. In all these roles, he has been responsible for providing leadership and direction to all cybersecurity and technology risk efforts associated with IT applications, communications, and computing services. As such, Wade has functioned as the face of security and has been responsible for the development and management of corporate-wide cybersecurity programs, as well as the planning and execution of enterprise-wide IT risk management strategies. Now, over to Wade.
Thank you, Lauren, and good morning to everyone. So today I'm going to speak with us all about cybercrime, and not just cybercrime as you might traditionally think of it, but cybercrime. Sorry about that, a little glitch. There you go. You see, I want for us to consider how our psychology and behavior can be big factors in preventing cybercriminals in their success. Let's face it, cybercrime is scary. In fact, cybercrime can be terrifying. In reality, though, cybercrime is nothing as compared to exploding cigarettes. Let me give you a little bit of backstory on that. It was the early 70s and cigarette smoking was socially acceptable. In fact, it was seen as cool. Not only was it advertised by athletes, cowboys, and celebrities, but it was okay for us to smoke just about anywhere. And like many at that time, my father smoked as well. And in my eyes, my father was pretty cool. He'd been a Marine, an honor guard to President Eisenhower, and one of his best friends was a Secret Service agent. So yeah, pretty cool guy. But there was one thing that was threatening my father's cool status, and that was me. I was a pretty good kid, if I like to say so myself, but I loved pulling pranks on people, especially if I could get one over on my cool father. Although relatively harmless between joy buzzers, whoopee cushions, and crank phone calls, not quite sure that my father ever felt really safe from my seemingly never-ending stream of pranks, but he would usually just sit back and light up a cigarette and take it all in stride. But one day, I got my hands on some exploding cigarette loads and thought it would be funny to plant one in my father's cigarettes, and it was. He lit up the cigarette, took a puff, and bang, the cigarette exploded right on cue. Once he was over the shock of it, even my father laughed because I'd gotten him pretty good. Now, naturally though, I decided to amp up my game. So a few days later, I put not one, but 5 exploding cigarettes into one cigarette and snuck that loaded cigarette back into the pack. And as young kids often do, I forgot all about it. That was until we were sitting in a restaurant that evening and my father lit up a cigarette, the cigarette. He took a puff and bang, all 5 cigarette loads exploded. Now, with people in the restaurant ducking for cover, my father let off a stream of expletives, some of which are so good I can still occasionally use them today, and just glared at me with tattered fragments of cigarette paper hanging from his lips. But whose fault was that, really? The precocious 10-year-old prankster? Sure, I'd managed to create an equivalent of what I think seemed like a stick of dynamite out of a cigarette, but I believe that my father holds some responsibility in that incident as well. You see, he'd held an incorrect belief about his safety in smoking those cigarettes. He had lit up thousands of times before in restaurants with no negative consequences. What he didn't understand was that the threat landscape had changed because I had just discovered exploding cigarette loads. Yes, I did sabotage his cigarettes, but his incorrect belief compared to the actual threat led to unhealthy behaviors. So let's unpack that a little bit. Belief leads to emotion, which leads to behavior, and repeated behavior leads to habit. So you see, I think that our thoughts around cybersecurity might be greatly informed from exploding cigarettes. I believe that cybersecurity isn't all about computer science. In fact, it's very much about behavioral science. And behavioral science teaches us that we can modify a habit by changing someone's behavior. But if we don't address that core belief, that behavior will come back. And while many of us will do a lot of training and awareness, and we go to great lengths to try to modify people's behaviors, we don't ever really address those core beliefs. So I want to talk a few moments about some core beliefs that I think are applicable to our discussion. Now, while this list might be a bit generalized, I want to focus on 3 core beliefs that most small and mid-sized organizations share relative to how vulnerable they might be to cybercrime. First, I'm not important and no one is looking for me. Second, I don't have anything anyone would want. And third, and perhaps most depressing, I can't stop them even if I wanted to. So we're going to talk about each one of these for a few moments. And belief 1, again, is I'm not important and no one is looking for me. Well, good news for all of you out there with low self-esteem. You are exactly who the cyber criminals are looking for. And if you don't believe me, I have some data. 48% of the population work for small and mid-sized businesses. 49% of small to mid-sized businesses have been hacked. 70% of all cybercrime is directed towards small to mid-sized businesses. 75% of employees have risky cyber behavior, and 60% of businesses will go out of business within 6 months of a critical breach or hack. So what's created all this, or what's changed? Well, we used to think that hackers looked a lot like this young man, nerds in their mother's basement tinkering around with computers. What's changed is now hackers have more in common with Al Capone. Organized crime has entered the picture and they have gone through an innovation cycle with their techniques and automation that would likely impress any Silicon Valley entrepreneur. I want to use a little bit of imagery to explore that more. Here we have our hacker in his natural habitat, apparently a river. Now that's a metaphor, but stay with me. So it's one skilled individual using a set of tools to get one fish. And while that skilled individual is engaged in that single behavior with that single fish, the rest of the fish are safe. But with technology and automation, we can have less skilled people reaching out blindly, touching every single one of us, and then look for those vulnerabilities. So how does that change our first belief? Well, it goes from I'm not important and no one is looking for me to I'm super important, and thanks to technology and automation, they will find me. Our second belief is I don't have anything anyone would want. This might be true if all that you think the hackers are interested in is intellectual property or trade secrets or some other very important data to your business, but that's really not the case any longer. I want to tell you a brief story about a friend of mine. We'll call him Tom. Tom owns a business. It's a manufacturing company. Products roll off his line and he makes money. He uses that money to pay his employees, to reinvest in the business, to pay for his kids' education, and maybe even take a nice vacation or two. But 4 months ago, Tom got hacked. One of his employees exercised some of that 75% of risky cyber behaviors I mentioned a moment ago and clicked on a link in an email that he shouldn't have clicked on. Malware was installed and spread around the entire network until it found the command and control center. That's the computer that controls the actual production line, and it encrypted that hard drive via ransomware. The bad guys then said to Tom, hey, give us 1,500 Bitcoin and we'll unlock it for you. Well, Tom had a couple of problems. First, he had no idea what Bitcoin was. Second, he had no idea what to do next. But it turns out Tom did the right thing. He didn't pay the ransom demand. He took 3 days to recover his systems from clean backups, because luckily he was prepared to do all that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as the presentation goes on. But with that line being down for 3 days, it really disrupted his business. If you know someone who's in manufacturing or production, the thought of a line being down for 3 days is the stuff of nightmares. But how does all this modify that second behavior or second belief? Well, it goes from, I don't have anything anyone would want, to, hey, I've got money, and the bad guys will be happy to just disrupt my life until they get it. Now, that third belief, I can't stop them even if I wanted to. It turns out this is not the first time that the word infection has had a high impact on our society. We used to have doctors who would cut people open with their less than clean hands, and people would die. But we found a pretty easy fix to that. Good hygiene and using soap and water. Really hard solution. The truth, it's almost as straightforward to practice good cyber hygiene. Let's look at that a little bit deeper. The soap and water for good cyber hygiene is making sure you have good backups and a good cybersecurity insurance policy. What that means is that you need to have a systemic way of backing up your data to somewhere else, where a responsible human being, and by the way, that shouldn't be you, is keeping track that it's happening. And when something bad happens, they'll help you put the data back. Too many people and organizations just back it up on a jump drive or feel like they're all set because they've got Dropbox, but that's not what's needed here. Similarly, having a good cybersecurity insurance policy can also be a little less than intuitive. You're not supposed to be investing in cybersecurity insurance just to get money back when something goes wrong. You want to have cybersecurity insurance so that professionals can help you to respond appropriately to your incident. So whatever policy you might end up with or investing in, make sure it's not just one of those, oh, hey, here's some money, because that's not going to do you really any good in the end. If you've got $1 million in your hand, but you still don't know who to call to get your business back up and running, then that $1 million isn't going to do much for your business. So the soap and water of cyber hygiene are backups in cyber insurance. But what if you're a bit more of a germaphobe? Then you don't want to be touched at all. In that case, gloves are the answer. Now, relative to cyber hygiene, that equates to moving your systems and services to a cloud solution, specifically though, a trusted cloud solution. And that's not the same as moving everything to an online drive. It's moving to cloud-based services. For example, if you're using email, and I assume everyone is, and you're running that email system in-house, then you might want to reconsider that, because if anything happens bad with that server that email is running on, you're out of luck. Moving it to a cloud-based email service like maybe Microsoft or Google helps to remove that risk. And yes, we all know that they have had their fair share of bad security press, but let's face it, even with that bad security press, they are so much better at doing it than any of our organizations are likely to be. But what if you can't move all your stuff to the cloud and some of it just has to reside locally? That's when we need the equivalent of a surgical mask. In the context of good cyber hygiene, that's solid patch management. You know those automatic patches that Microsoft keeps pushing and wanting you to impose upon you, but you're in the middle of maybe creating a PowerPoint presentation for some webinar on behavior modification to prevent cybercrime, just saying. And you're frustrated that it keeps trying to reboot your computer. Well, guess what? You just need to let it happen. Because most of those vulnerabilities that are affecting us today are variants of problems that have been around for a very, very long time. And in many cases, the solutions are out there. We just can't be bothered patching our machines. So get the stuff off your local machine, put it into a cloud service that someone else can manage for you, and allow automatic patching of your machines. And there's another thing that comes into play with every successful surgery and also comes into play when we're talking about cybersecurity, and that's a plan. For instance, the United States, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, used taxpayer dollars in 2013 to come up with a plan for us. And if we follow that framework, we'll be able to identify our important stuff, protect our important stuff, detect if your important stuff is being messed with, respond to alerts about your important stuff, and recover your important stuff if something bad happens. If you've ever been treated for something by a doctor, more than likely that treatment might have included some sort of vaccine to prevent a disease or medication to recover from an ailment. Relative to securing our infrastructure, that's where advanced cyber technology comes into play. Practicing good cyber hygiene and having a solid, well thought out plan is extremely important. But to ensure we have fully protected our organizations requires integrating the right technologies and having trusted relationships with the right technology partners. After all, soap and water can't be successful in fighting all diseases just by themselves. By doing all of this, you're now practicing good cyber hygiene, have a solid plan along with advanced technologies appropriate for your business, and have established relationships with trusted partners. So that third belief goes from I can't stop them even if I wanted to I can drastically reduce the risk of infection if I practice good cyber hygiene, have a solid plan, and select the right technology and trusted partners. So let's take a little deeper dive into a few things. We're going to learn on the next several slides the how, why, and what of cybercrime. We're going to learn how the criminals are coming at us. We're going to learn what's going on in our genius brains that make us so susceptible to how the hackers are coming at us. And we're going to learn, hey, what is it that's my role in all of this anyway? So I want to jump into a quick definition of cybercrime. Cybercrime is said to be defined as a set of criminal activities carried out by means of computers or the internet. The problem is, for me, that definition is completely useless because what isn't happening over computers or the internet? After all, most of our lives are spent staring at screens these days, right? We've got our smartphones, tablets, laptops, smart TVs, smart watches. We've automated our houses, and the list just goes on and on. I really look at cybercrime as just another tool in otherwise normal criminal activities. But let's take a look at who's doing it. We have organized crime. And as I've mentioned before, they figured out how to run cybercrime as a business. And they're in it for the money, short and sweet. Nation states are also in the game. They're in it for power and politics, but they don't just attack each other. Once upon a time, North Korea saw that Sony made a movie about them, and they weren't happy about it. So they went off and attacked Sony. We have hacktivists. These are the people who have what they believe to be a noble cause that they're hacking for. And we have lone wolves, the stereotypical hacker who are just really curious about what they can do. These are the people you imagine still living in their mother's basement eating pizza rolls. But as scary as these four are, they are nothing compared to the most terrifying hacker of all, the script kiddie. Yes, I know it looks adorable, but stay with me here. Script kiddies are terrifying because they actually have no idea of what they're doing. They just buy malware, hacks, ransomware, etc. from the dark web. They download that software to their machines, distribute it to the machines that they break into, and then use those machines to launch it. And because they have no idea of what they are doing, they also have no idea how to fix the damage they do. Like organized crime, script kiddies are motivated by money, lots and lots of money. And how do they do these bad things to us? Well, it really boils down to four primary pathways in which they do it. Drive-by downloads, man-in-the-middle attacks, password compromises, and social engineering. And we're going to speak a little bit about each of these. I'm going to start with drive-by downloads. This is where you download something that you think is something else, and there's hidden code inside of it. For example, maybe you've been prompted to download a receipt. It's a PDF, and when you open that PDF, it automatically installs a virus. or maybe it's a bit of software that you would typically trust, but there seems to be something different about this one. In recent times, we're typically looking at ransomware when we're speaking about drive-by downloads. Ransomware occurs when someone clicks on something that they shouldn't, and malware is installed that encrypts information or perhaps entire systems, making it unusable. The bad guys then typically demand Bitcoin to unlock the data or the systems. But here's the problem. Script kiddies send 90+% of all ransomware attacks. Consequently, they're really good at breaking into things, but they're horrible at fixing what they broke. There may be exceptions, but in my opinion, one should never pay ransomware for two reasons. First, because after you pay, the chances that they'll actually unlock your systems are very small, again, because they don't know how to do it. And two, after you've paid, you'll go on a list of people who do pay. And that list will be sold over and over and over again on the dark web, and you'll likely be hacked again and again. The best way to guard against ransomware is to make sure that you have good backups in place, so that if you are impacted, you can simply restore the data and systems to a point prior to being encrypted. So how do the bad guys come at us with drive-by downloads? Well, there's actually a few ways. Maybe you've seen an online ad, a malvertisement, that's intended to navigate you to some questionable website with the intention of getting you to enter your username or password or download something that you shouldn't. Or maybe they'll try to get at you through a malicious site, although those can be fairly easy to spot. If you're going to a site that you might be curious about, but it doesn't quite look legit or feel right, be very cautious about clicking on anything. But the problem gets even more complex when the bad guys have compromised sites that you might already have trusted. For instance, there's a whole rash of attacks on religious sites where people just naturally trust the sites. But those sites had already been hacked unknowingly because while it was a high trust site, it also had a low budget. So there really was not much security deployed on it. Now, app stores are another spot where you'll find questionable code. Although Apple has actually more stringent security controls in place before making apps available for download. That doesn't mean they're 100% foolproof, just that they're trying to take appropriate precautions. But be particularly cautious of free apps on the Android store or other marketplaces, because those haven't been vetted through nearly the same level of precautions. So then how are we going to protect ourselves? Well, first, we're going to make sure that your machines stay patched. That means making sure that your phones, tablets, computers all have that operating systems and applications updated with the latest security patches. Remember, script kiddies do 90+% of the cybercrime out there. And what they're doing is almost always based off of old, unpatched vulnerabilities. They're successful at it, though, because people haven't taken the time to patch. But if you patch your systems, you will be significantly safer. Also, you're not going to log in as administrator. Now, administrator access means that you can install software, issue commands, and basically do anything you want, which sounds great. But it also means that if you click on something you shouldn't, and you're logged in with administrator rights, you've just given those same permissions to that virus or malware to do those bad things too. So our next section we're going to talk about is man-in-the-middle attacks. This is simply when someone's listening and watching your traffic. Here's a quick real-life example. This beautiful fish tank is located in Las Vegas, Nevada. Not only is it beautiful, but it's complicated. They've got to keep the pH balance right. They've got to keep the water temperature right. They've got to keep the thing clean. They need to feed the fish, etc., etc. And all of this is run by, you guessed it, a computer. And that computer is on a network. Well, it happened that some gentleman sat at this bar, attached to the Wi-Fi of the fish tank, and jumped over to the open Wi-Fi that the other customers were sitting at. That guy was able to sit there and record all of the internet traffic from the other patrons sitting at that bar. And in the time he was there, he gathered a ton of data from those around him. But he didn't stop there. He also jumped across the network and hit the reservation desk and stole a whole bunch of identity information from their point of sale systems as well. Here's the net of all of this. People and machines are listening. And if you're attaching to a network you don't know or trust, even a fish tank, things can go sideways. As I said, people are going to listen, and they're going to do that in a couple of ways, like by sitting on unsecured Wi-Fi. They're going to be at Starbucks, at airports, college bars, etc., anywhere really that there's a free Wi-Fi system out there where you can attach to. And there's also fake Wi-Fi. There's a technique where bad guys will sit at the airport with their own routing devices. These devices would broadcast a message like free airport Wi-Fi, and people would take the bait and connect to the internet through these routing devices. They're more than happy to allow you to connect to the internet using their device because they're trying to record what you're doing. So people would connect, and then they would record all the things that they were doing. We also have more technical aspects of this called MAC spoofing and cross-site scripting. Now, we're not going to go into that, but just know that there are very technological ways out there to really jump around the internet and the networks and that you're attached to in order to listen in. But what exactly are you going to do to stay safe? Well, first thing is only get on the internet through trusted connections like your company's Wi-Fi or your cell phone's hotspot. When I'm traveling, I connect my laptop to my cell phone's hotspot whenever possible. That way, the only person in the conversation besides myself is my cell phone carrier and my computer. But sometimes you don't have cell phone service, and the only option you have is connect to public Wi-Fi. So the way that you should do that is to keep yourself safe is to use something called a VPN. That stands for Virtual Private Network. These are very inexpensive pieces of software that sit on your device and create an encrypted tunnel between you and the data that you're trying to reach. That way, if somebody is listening in online, all they're really going to hear is the equivalent of white noise and static. And finally, whatever site you're trying to access should have security-enabled SSL. That stands for Secure Socket Layer. You'll know that it's enabled when you see HTTPS in the URL. If you only see HTTP with no S, you're not secure. I wouldn't type anything into that website. All right, so now we're into passwords. So we've just secured all the things that let us communicate safely online, but then again, practically everything is online. And often, the only thing standing between us and the hackers are username and password. And I'm sorry to say that those are the things that are most traditionally easiest to crack. So let me tell you a story about one of my favorite stores. I love Target. Maybe some of you prefer the fancier pronunciation of Target. One of the reasons I love shopping at Target is because of how comfortable I am in their stores. Whether it's hot or cold outside, I'm comfortable inside. And all of that climate control is being handled by a computerized HVAC unit. This HVAC unit needs to be maintained, though. It has to have regular updates. Remember, we talked about patching our computers. Well, this is the same sort of thing. To enable that, Target allowed those HVAC units to be remotely attached to the internet so that the maintenance can be done without ever having to go into the store. Very convenient, right? Well, yes, but here's what happened. Some cyber criminals went to Google and they typed the name of the HVAC unit. And they found a PDF of the user manual for it, and they downloaded it. On about page 4 of that user manual, they found the default username and password for the administrator login for that HVAC unit. Target had not bothered to change the default username and password. Now remember why having administrative privilege is bad? Because you can do anything you want. Well, they now had administrative privilege, so they installed malware onto the HVAC unit at all the stores. It turns out that those HVAC units were sitting on the very same network as the cash registers. So that malware attacked the point of sale cash registers, installed itself there, and then began to record credit card information as soon as anyone would swipe the card. The malware then sent that info back to the HVAC units and on to the cyber criminals. The result was that over $150 million in losses and 250 million in fraud to the financial industries. Oh, and the CEO of Target is now the ex-CEO of Target. So to compromise your passwords, the bad guys are coming at you in two primary ways. They're going to try to either steal your credentials or they're going to break into databases that have your credentials. Most of that happens by simply trying to convince you to type a username or password into something that you think is something else. There's also brute force attacks where the result is that they steal the database that has all the passwords in it. This is why we ask you to have long passwords with lots of variation in them, because even if they get that database, it makes it harder for them to get any real value from it because of how complicated your password is. So here's what you're going to do to stay safe. You're never going to put your username and password into a site you don't know. Just don't do it. You're not going to use the same username and password everywhere, because if you have the same username and password for 4 different sites, you can be guaranteed that if one of those sites is compromised, they are all compromised. And whenever and wherever possible, you want to use something called two-factor authentication, or 2FA. But what is that? So username and password is the first factor. The second is when you log in with that username and password, something else happens. For example, I use Gmail. When I type my username and password into Gmail, my phone buzzes and it pops up with a note that says, "Hey, Wade, are you trying to log into Gmail?" If I hit yes, I'm allowed to access my email. If I hit no, it blocks that attempt from wherever it's originating. So now I don't as much care if you get my username and password for my Gmail account, because if you don't also have my phone, you can't get in. And there are many uses for two-factor authentication. Your bank probably has a free one. And if it's any online service, it's highly likely that they're giving away two-factor authentication solutions as well, because it's so much cheaper for them to give you that security tool than it is for them to respond when someone has stolen your username or password. But for those times when usernames and passwords are your only defense, I want to give you a new tool to use. It's called passphrases, and yes, all the cool kids are doing it. So a passphrase replaces a password with a sentence. For example, never share your password. That's a pretty long password. And all we did was remove the spaces from a sentence, and that's what makes it a passphrase. But what if we want to make that a little better? We add a capital letter to the beginning of every word. Never share your password. Or better yet, never share your password, 1, 2, 3, exclamation point. That version checks all the boxes. It's super long, has capital letters and lowercase letters, it has numbers, and it has a special character. Now, if you're feeling very bold and want to go even further then maybe try these last 2 examples. But those 2 will probably take you about 17 minutes to type in. You'll never remember them. I really suggest going with a version of that third one. It's just about the right level. Now, obviously, I am not suggesting that you should specifically use the words "never share your password" as your password or passphrase. Please don't. But you can use other passphrases that are easy for you to remember. A good passphrase for you might be, "My kids are awesome," or maybe "My neighbor's kids are better." It all depends on your situation, I guess. But be creative, come up with something that you can remember. And then based off of what you're logging into, you can even modify that passphrase. Never share your bank, 1, 2, 3, exclamation. Never share your Facebook, 1, 2, 3, exclamation. Never share your email, 1, 2, 3, exclamation point. You get the idea. So let's talk a little bit about social engineering. What is it? Well, it boils down to cyber criminals using you as their weapon of choice to hack into your organization or your life. This woman is a social engineering hacker in real life, and she was at a conference called Black Hat and was asked to demonstrate social engineering. At one point, she said to the interviewer, "Maybe I'll call your cell phone provider and see if I can get them to give me your email address." The interviewer highly doubted she could do that. So she ran a little software on her own cell phone to spoof it to make it seem like she was coming from his phone, and then called customer service. When the phone started to ring, she began playing a YouTube video that was hours and hours of a baby crying, and she jacked the volume all the way up. So there's a baby screaming in the background, and she's telling a story to the customer service agent that went something like this. "I can't remember what my email address is that we used on the account, and the baby's crying, and my husband needs this, and he was supposed to add me to the account, and I don't think he did that, and this is just terrible. Well, within 60 seconds, the customer service agent had given her the email that she was looking for. Not only that, she got added to the account as a signer and changed the PIN. She added a fictional daughter to the account as well. Now, let's remember that that customer service rep on the other end, he was not the bad guy. In fact, he was very likely a very, very good person because he was trying to help her. And we are all likely very, very good people. You couldn't drive to work every morning if you didn't trust the people around you to be good people. The idea that we can operate in a society means that we need to trust other people accordingly and to be helpful, kind, and courteous to each other. So our genius brains are pre-programmed to help people. I was on a plane ride back from the West Coast a while back, and there were 3 little angels sitting a couple of rows in front of me. And for 90% of that trip, they were angels, absolutely quiet, snuggling with their parents. But for 10% of that trip, they were screaming their heads off. And that's 10% of a 6-hour flight. And you know what the response was from everyone? They wanted to help. It's in our DNA, it's in our genius brains to try to help people in need. Of course, the Romanian grandmother who was singing at the top of her lungs to the kids to try to keep them quiet was probably not actually helping, but I digress. So there are people taking advantage of our pre-programming to be good, decent human beings, to make you do something they want you to do. And the primary way they're going to come at you is through email. We call that phishing. And if they've dug a little bit into your social media, they can create something that's more specific to you called spear phishing. And spear phishing extends into mining of your social networks. For instance, maybe you've just tweeted, "I'm so mad at my bank, Wells Fargo. I've been standing in this line for 2 hours." Well, guess what? There's software out there that just captured that tweet and then uploaded and updated its own databases to indicate that at your name uses Wells Fargo. And once they tie your Twitter account back to your email, they will send you something that looks just like a Wells Fargo logon screen saying it's time to update your password. So you type in your username and password because you think that's exactly what you're doing, but you really haven't. You just gave your password away and now they're into your bank account. And just like that, they've got you. Other ways to manipulate people include intimidation and persuasion. For instance, there's a phone call going around claiming to be from the IRS. It says that you've not paid your taxes, and if you don't give them $50, they will send the local police to come and arrest you. But it's just not true. For one thing, the government does not have a history of working that well together. For another, no government agency is going to ask for money over the phone. But knowing that is still not stopping it from happening because people are still paying the $50 just out of intimidation. Now, intimidation is fear. Persuasion is when they want to play on your emotional side, your willingness to give, like willingness to respond to a frantic mom and a crying baby. But what are you going to do to stay safe? Well, almost everything up to this point has been a technology solution. We've talked about defenses like patching, not logging in as administrator, using your phone's hotspot or a VPN. But once they touch base with you directly, there's no technology between you and them. You are the primary defense from social engineering. I want to take a moment to look at a couple of examples of phishing emails. Here's one. It basically says, hey, a package didn't get to where it was supposed to. And you might be thinking, this email wasn't supposed to come to me, but if I do a little bit of work, I bet I can find out who it needs to go to and I can help that person out. Unfortunately, this is obviously a fake email, and here's some ways that you can figure it out. Number one, is this a company you would ever communicate with? If you've never heard of Freight International Service, then chances are that this is not someone you should be talking to. Also, are you in a department where you'd expect to get a package? If not, then this email is absolutely something you shouldn't be opening. And see that print a receipt button. If you hover your mouse over that, you'll likely see a URL come up. And you'll be able to determine if that embedded link matches the URL that's inside the email. If it doesn't, you probably don't want to touch this one either. And by the way, don't download anything if you can avoid it. If it says get and print a receipt or get and download something in an email, all of those should be warning flags. If you come across something like this, don't click on anything and don't respond to it. If you have an IT team, make them aware and let them handle it from there. Here's another example of a phishing email. And actually, it looks like something that my 11-year-old granddaughter might have written to me. She's just gotten into texting and refuses to use full words. So let's look at this. Again, invoicenotices.com. Is this a company that you'd normally communicate with? This attachment looks questionable because it's got a whole bunch of numbers in the HTML and doesn't really tell you much about it. If you hover over it, are you getting a URL that's legit? Also, look at those grammar mistakes. Could you please let me know? And the attached with too many T's. If there are grammar errors and spelling mistakes, and it looks like my 11-year-old granddaughter is emailing you, then it's probably something that should raise some alarms. Another one here is, hello. It's likely that if you get an email without your name in it, you're pretty certain that this person has no idea who you are, and it's not something you should respond to. So here's the big finish. What did we learn? Well, we learned that we need to reestablish 3 newly modified core beliefs. 1, I'm super important, and thanks to technology and automation, they will find me. 2, hey, I've got money, and the bad guys will be happy to disrupt my life until they get it. And 3, I can drastically reduce the risk of infection if I practice good cyber hygiene, have a solid plan, and select the right technology and trusted partners. We also learned that basic good cyber hygiene can go a long way to ward off infection in our businesses. That includes patching our environments, ensuring secure off-site backups, having a robust cyber insurance policy in place, moving to trusted cloud services wherever appropriate, and utilizing advanced cybersecurity technologies and trusted relationships. And finally, we also learned there are a lot of reasons that hackers are coming at you personally and after your organization. The ways that they're coming at you are always varied, but they know that your genius brain is pre-programmed to respond to them. And because of that, people are the primary targets of hackers. And they're also coming at you at home. They're not just coming at you at work because they're interested in you. This isn't a work problem. This is an internet problem. And if you're on the internet, wherever you are, the hackers are coming at you. So in wrapping this up, it's my hope that we can replace our old, inaccurate beliefs with the new beliefs that I presented. We've learned a few things about good cyber hygiene. We've gotten more familiar with some of the most likely ways that cyber criminals are coming at you and how to be better prepared to ward them off. So it's my hope that if we can do these things that I've outlined, then you will not have to experience the similar horrible consequences that both my father and I experienced due to his inaccurate beliefs and my ill-advised behavior. Thanks so much for participating today, and Lauren, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Wade. We'll start our Q&A now. If you have any questions, now is the time to write them in your chat box. It looks like we have a few questions already. First one, what if you are somewhere where the cell signal is not good and all you have is a Wi-Fi to work?
Right. So as I mentioned in the presentation, sometimes you just have to go on public Wi-Fi. If it's at all possible, I strongly urge that you look into, purchase something that's appropriate for you and install a VPN, a virtual private network. That will guarantee that you establish an encrypted tunnel between you and whatever you're communicating with, so that no one can see or sniff or have access to anything that you're transporting via that encrypted tunnel.
Okay. You know, I've heard of VPN apps. Is that something that's safe, or is that something we should stay away from?
No. I mean, you need to research it. Again, the Apple Store, the Apple App Store, it tends to be much more refined in how they research and then certify apps to go into their store. But a VPN app is absolutely what you would need to install on a mobile device, whether that's a laptop or tablet, and also on your laptops. If you're running a Mac or a Mac product, you can get that from the Apple Store. If you're running a Windows device, you can download that from a Windows application store as well.
Okay. The next question, I think, just needs a little bit more clarification, because I know you went over this, but what do you do with double authentication?
Two-factor authentication. So 2FA or two-factor authentication, sometimes it's referred to as MFA, multi-factor authentication. It all implies that there is more than one check in place to make sure that you are who you say you are. So again, usually the first factor is username and password. That might trigger, depending upon the application or who's provided that two-factor authentication. It might trigger a number of things. You might get an email sent to you that asks you to verify who you are in some way, shape, or form. You might get a text sent to your phone that asks the same type of questions, or asks you to sends you a code and asks you to enter the code they sent you. In some cases, you might get a phone call from somebody asking you to validate, or it might be an automated attendant on the other end of the phone asking you to validate who you are. In any case, whatever version of multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication is being used, it's all in place as another layer of defense to make sure that before they grant you access to whatever you're asking to access, that you are who you say you are and that it's valid. So again, if you don't have that second form, if somebody has your username and password and you get a text on your phone saying, please enter this code into your screen for your bank account information, for instance, and that should raise a red flag because you didn't just ask for it. So now that prompts you to contact your bank in this example and say, I just got a request to enter a two-factor validation. I didn't issue the initial request. Somebody must have my password or my user ID. That will begin the proper chain of events with your bank or whomever it is that you're working with to reset that, so that what they've just stolen is now of no use to them. And not only that, they can't resell it to someone else and have them take advantage of you either.
The next question is, any practical information about who we should hire to make sure all our transactions are secure?
Well, so I won't put in a shameless plug for my organization, but you can read into that. There are a number of organizations out there who can help you. So I'm assuming that most of the people who are participating in this webinar would classify themselves as working in a small to mid-sized business. If that's the case, you want to make sure that you are working with an organization that has a good understanding of how small to mid-sized businesses operate, including budgetary constraints and so forth. You can go with one of the big guys, but they're going to cost you a lot more, and they tend to focus their efforts on enterprise class organizations, the large corporations out there who have deeper pockets and more resources, both in terms of money and people to throw at this. So there's a lot of organizations out there that can be of help. I suppose I could help narrow that down if somebody wanted to contact me, and I could talk with them a little bit more about what their needs are and try to find them the right resource.
Mm-hmm. So this next one is a two-part question, so I'll ask the first question first. Can you expand on patching?
Sure. So whether you have a phone, a tablet, a laptop, a desktop, or some number of servers that you're talking about, it typically will have the requirement to be connected to the internet. Those requirements will bring up I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry, my headset died and I had to switch over to my computer. audio. Those will have requirements to connect to the internet. They will also have vulnerabilities attached to them that come up from time to time. There are researchers out there who specifically look for vulnerabilities in software and operating systems, and based upon finding those vulnerabilities, companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, Adobe, whomever, will come up with patches to resolve or mitigate those vulnerabilities that were found. It's very important that you apply those patches, those security patches, so that you eliminate your systems from being in the pool of systems that are vulnerable to those that were just identified, because those vulnerabilities are what the bad guys are utilizing to get into your systems. I recommend that there be a regular, regimented, scheduled series of applying patches. Microsoft is famous for having Patch Tuesday. Every Tuesday, Microsoft comes out with the latest, greatest patches, security patches. That can be overwhelming to think that you have to patch every Tuesday. Not all of those vulnerabilities are critical or severe in nature. This is where using those trusted relationships to help understand what's applicable to your business comes into play, because someone else who's got that technical expertise can say, okay, these 5 patches just came out, none of them apply to you this week, we don't have to worry about them. But it is critical to maintain that patch level. So when you get prompted on your laptop that says these patches are available, click here to install now or defer to some other time, or the same type of thing on your phone, you get an alert that says there's a patch available or there's a new version of the operating system available. Those are typically generated not on a whim. It costs those organizations a lot of money to produce those patches, test them, validate them, QA them, get them out there, manage the implementations of them. They don't do this just because they've gotten, oh, well, let's change the color of that screen from yellow to orange. Those patches are there because they're typically high value in nature. So we need to apply them and be diligent about that so that we're reducing the footprint or the landscape by which we can be attacked externally.
Great. And so the second part of the question is, if I get a call saying I have suspicious activity, is that also a scam?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. If you get a phone call from somebody saying that you have suspicious activity on your account, I would say to that person, thank you very much, I'll look into it, hang up with them, and call the organization that they purported to be from. So if your bank calls you and says, we have suspicious activity on your account, thank them, call the bank back, and don't ask them for a phone number because they'll give you their phone number. Call the bank back at a phone number, customer service that you can expect to get a hold of them at, and validate that that was a legitimate call. If it was, they'll be happy to continue to work with you. If it wasn't, you'll know right off the bat because they'll say, no, we would never issue those phone calls, or we would communicate with you in a different way, or whatever their standard response is. So in some cases, there may be a reason to do that. Now, I know that, for instance, Capital One, I have a Capital One credit card. Capital One it has an app for my phone. They're very good and very prompt about sending alerts and messages out. I know where they're coming from. They're coming through that app. I know that they're legitimate. If it's a phone call, if it's an unsolicited email or an unsolicited text, it's likely a phishing attempt to gather some information from you, account number. Sir, could you please validate your password for us? Or could you please tell us the security questions that you use and the answers to them? Those are all signs. So sometimes they're legitimate, but we need to be smart about how we respond to them. I would suggest that the better way to respond is to simply not take that bait, but call or contact the organization that purports to be contacting you and validate it for yourself.
Okay, and then we have another question talking about the VPN. Do you know if they're asking about BlackBerry security? It sounds like they have a BlackBerry phone. Do you know how secure these devices are and if they're able to get a VPN on them?
So BlackBerry is a unique situation. In certain aspects, you could consider BlackBerry to be more secure, and they would certainly purport themselves to be more secure than more commercially available consumerized devices like Apple or Android devices. And so BlackBerry has some benefit to it. There are VPN-like capabilities available to BlackBerry. They tend, my experience with them, and this is only based on my own experience, they tend to be a little bit more costly, a little bit less varied in terms of how many choices you would have, and a bit more restrictive. That said, I would seriously look into whether or not there is one that's available to your use. If you are using a BlackBerry, you probably purchased it through a particular reseller, and you can contact those folks to ask about what's the most secure VPN or secure method of encrypting, creating an encrypted tunnel for your communications.
So this is another VPN question. What do you do if you may not always have a cell signal, but you have the double, or sorry, this isn't about VPN, this is about double authentication. What do you do if you don't always have like a cell signal, and you're stuck, like maybe like you're traveling internationally or your phone may not work for you? Do you know how that would work?
I'm not sure I get the question. Could you repeat it one more time?
So, you know how like you said the double authentication, you might get like a text, so you'll have to verify it, you know,
Yes.
so what if you're in like a bad cell area and you're trying to get onto your email? Do you have any suggestions on how to go about that? Like, for example, like that double text doesn't get sent to you?
Yeah, so I get it. So unfortunately, the answer is this isn't a perfect world. So there are going to be instances where you're in a space that you might not have cell signal available, might not be able to get that second factor on your mobile device. If those, hopefully that's not a common occurrence for you, but if that is the case, then you can look to do some other form of two-factor that might include making a phone call or receiving a phone call as opposed to a digital signal. You might refer to it, default to an analog signal where you can actually make a phone call or receive a phone call. I would just say that it's not a perfect solution, but it will address the vast majority of instances where you are trying to confirm identity before connecting.
Okay, and then we have another question. I know that you already answered this, but I think to just reiterate, is using a hotspot any better than using just a regular free Wi-Fi, say at the airport?
So my answer will be a qualified absolutely. However, that assumes that that hotspot is yours and you're not going off of somebody else's hotspot. So if you're using your own phone to be the hotspot, it's absolutely more secure than going over free Wi-Fi. Again, there's a password associated with using that hotspot, using your phone's hotspot. No one else has that password, and no one else would be able to connect to your hotspot. And in many cases, you can establish your hotspot such that it notifies you if somebody is trying to utilize your hotspot. So yes, I would always, if I were traveling, if I were in an airport, in a public area, and I was not confident in the Wi-Fi or capability that I was on a secured Wi-Fi, I would always opt to use my own hotspot because that is a secured mechanism.
Great. Well, that looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. As a reminder to everyone, this webinar has been recorded and will be available to view in the next few days on our website at marealtor.com. So thank you so much, Wade, for your presentation. I think it was very informative. And thank you to everyone for joining today. We hope to see you all next time.
Thank you all.